Since the beginning of the day, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces has recorded 71 combat engagements on the front line. The Russian army was most active in launching assaults in the Konstantinovka, Lyman and Alexandrovka directions. What is the situation in Pokrovsk, where, according to the Ukrainian General Staff, Russian forces managed to infiltrate the city? And where are Ukraine's defense forces firmly holding the blue and yellow flag, thwarting Putin's plans? Stay tuned to find out.
The army has changed its tactics and is increasingly resorting to mechanized assaults. As noted by the Ukrainian General Staff, since the beginning of this week alone, there have been 41 Russian offensives with armored vehicles across the entire front. Some of these attacks are directed at the Pokrovsk sector. Ukrainian border guards showed how they repelled one of these attacks. Drone operators struck 14 units of heavy Russian armored vehicles and a tank, and also eliminated about 50 Russian soldiers. Since the start of the day, the General Staff of Ukraine has recorded 71 clashes along the entire front line. On the Kostiantynivka bridgehead, the Russian army stormed Ukrainian positions 9 times. Another 8 times, Russian forces tried to break through Ukrainian defenses on the Lyman section of the front. Ukrainian forces are holding their lines in the south and on the Alexandrivka direction, where they have already repelled 7 Russian attacks since the start of the day. The situation remains difficult on the Okrytine section of the Pokrovsk direction, according to the General Staff of Ukraine. Intense fighting is ongoing, and several hundred Russians, taking advantage of their numerical superiority, managed to infiltrate Pokrovsk.
The enemy, by using the space between positions and infiltrating with small infantry groups, has amassed about 200 servicemen in the city. Small arms battles are ongoing in the settlement, and UAV units are actively operating. Enemy attempts to advance deeper and gain a foothold in the urban area are being stopped through counter-sabotage measures.
Russia has concentrated its main forces on the Pokrovsk direction, as Putin has repeatedly issued orders and set specific deadlines for the capture of the Pokrovsk agglomeration. With the prospect of advancing toward Kostiantynivka, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, analysts say. But for several months now, Russian generals have been unable to carry out the Kremlin dictator's plan. Additional units are being brought in and various tactics are being tried.
Specifically near Pokrovsk, they have deployed airborne troops, naval infantry, and separate groups with combat experience, as they claim, but this is aggression in specific urban conditions. That's why entering the territory of Pokrovsk and establishing themselves in certain locations where they've dug in, so to speak, is now their new model. Since
the end of August, the Ukrainian armed forces have held 9 settlements in the Pokrovsk direction and have already cleared another 9 of Russian sabotage groups. According to the General Staff, in 2 months on the Dobropilia bridgehead, the Russian army has already lost nearly 16,000 soldiers and more than 1,300 pieces of equipment. Ukraine's defense forces and prisoner exchange fund are also being replenished.
Street fighting is underway. They practically never stop day or night because our task is to destroy them with a special unit that is better trained and prepared for these actions. The task is difficult because the city is large and there are many buildings. It's not as simple as clearing out some village. In the past
24 hours, Russia lost 900 soldiers in the war against Ukraine. And according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Russia's total combat losses since the start of the full-scale invasion have already exceeded 1,136,000 military personnel. In addition, yesterday, 4 Russian tanks, 18 armored fighting vehicles, 15 artillery systems, 214 drones, and more than 80 units of Russian automotive equipment were destroyed. Ukrainian intelligence operatives struck Russian air defense systems in occupied Crimea. Drones from the special unit of the main intelligence directorate, Primary, managed to bypass the Russians' air defenses and destroyed valuable equipment belonging to the occupiers. The intelligence service published footage of the drones' precise operations. 3 radar stations, Triumph, Terik and Nebo U, as well as a Russian landing ship, were hit in the strike. A wave of arson attacks has swept through Russia, targeting infrastructure used by the Russian army in its war against Ukraine. According to Freedom sources in the main intelligence directorate, the Russian armed forces are increasingly recording fires in relay cabinets and electrical panels on railways, as well as at communication hubs. Intelligence officers showed a video of members of the Russian resistance movement setting fires using kerosene and other flammable liquids and recording it on video. As a result, Russians are left without electricity and communication, and the Kremlin's army faces logistical difficulties. Sudden fires at key Russian logistics and power supply nodes have occurred across almost the entire territory of the aggressor country. In particular, electrical switchboards, relay cabinets, and communication towers have caught fire just in the past week in Moscow, Irkutsk region, Vologda, Sterlitamak, Kalachinsk, Pionersky, Zarechny, Krasnoselye, Mramorny, and so on. To be continued. The infrastructure will burn even brighter, while Russian homes, on the contrary, will grow darker.
They are holding back the enemy in the Lyman direction. This is one of the hottest sections of the front in the Donetsk region. The 63rd Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces is preventing the advance of the Russian army with the help of strike FPV drones. Our correspondent Alexei Baranovsky reports on how military engineers are working in the frontline area.
These shots show the work of strike drones from the Kreshe unit of the 63rd Brigade, which is part of the 3rd Army Corps of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. The fighters continue to hold back attacks by Russian invaders in the Lyman direction in the Donetsk region. Behind every successful hit on a target lies the painstaking work of the brigade's engineers.
There are no more mechanized assaults as such, because there are simply too many people who are eager to destroy a tank whenever they get the opportunity. That's really great. This means they can no longer storm forward like that. But still, they have a huge amount of manpower, and we have to do something about it.
The workshop's task is to prepare strike drones which have been delivered to the brigade by manufacturers for use by FPV pilots at combat positions.
Our conditions are constantly and continuously changing, evolving, and shifting. That's exactly why we always have to come up with new firmware solutions, search for it, find it, and then figure it out thoroughly. We need to make new drones, design and build better antennas, work to improve our connections, and add some new innovative parts and components. In short, if we stand still, if we do not adapt or move forward, we simply won't win or succeed.
The drones are already fully prepared. After everything is carefully and thoroughly installed on them, we have a test stand, so to speak. We connect it and then thoroughly check all of the drone's functions from communication to detonation. So before we send it out, it goes through a complete and comprehensive test, except for the actual flight itself. The flight test is always done before we even start doing anything else with the drone.
The servicemen say that Ukrainian drone manufacturers are trying to keep up with technological changes at the front and take into account all the feedback and requests from the military.
They often ask for feedback, and sometimes we do it ourselves. We just ask, why is it like this? We need it to be different, and of course the manufacturer takes that into account.
The UAV workshop is a specialized kind of innovation laboratory where dedicated servicemen come up with creative engineering solutions and manufacture important parts for drones using their own equipment.
When the time comes to buy something, you just go and buy it because it's needed in the workshop. There's no way around it. Whether it's some spare parts for drones or just making an antenna, that's also a part you can make with a 3D printer. I came in, I know its value, I just bought it. Well, it'll pay for itself anyway. Whether it's for the military or for me, it doesn't matter. Right now, at this very moment, it's absolutely needed. Right now, it's basically serving as a spare part, just in case it's required. It's currently drawing the bottom platform, which is an essential component. And of course, the rim is also being drawn. All of these steps are important in the process.
Both masters worked as electronics engineers in commercial companies before the army, and even after joining the defense forces of Ukraine, they kept their specialty.
The fact that I know electronics is exactly what's needed here. Sometimes, of course, you can just take a diagram from the internet, see where everything gets soldered, solder it, and it'll work. But there are situations when something doesn't work, and you don't know why. That's when knowledge of electronics really helps.
Right now, this workshop specializes and is effectively holding back the advance of Russian occupiers in Donbass. However, in the future, the servicemen want to expand and start working with ground-based robotic systems.
The work is extremely interesting. I'm not even talking about the fact that it's useful, but even just for Baranovsky,
Donetsk region, Gliatko, Afrika.
The sanctions imposed by the EU and the US against Russia are a painful blow. This was stated by Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Andriy Sybiha. He noted that the first sanctions imposed by the United States against the Russian Federation during Trump's second term draw an important strategic line. The Kremlin no longer has grounds to hope for Western weakness or the possibility of deceiving America.
Putin says that everything is fine with the Russian economy. His propagandists repeat mantras that the sanctions have no effect. And the more bravado there is, the more obvious it becomes that the reality is exactly the opposite. Things will only get worse for Russia if it does not stop its war against Ukraine. Sanctions will intensify and revenues from oil and gas will decline. Ukraine's strikes are becoming more destructive. Russian losses at the front are increasing even more. International isolation is deepening further.
The United States is preparing to strengthen sanctions against Russia, in particular against key sectors of the Russian economy, if the Kremlin once again refuses to end the war. This was reported by Reuters. Washington is also discussing the possibility of using Russia's frozen assets to help Ukraine. Meanwhile, Putin's resources are rapidly running out, and he has once again resorted to nuclear blackmail. Kristina Dombrovskaya will continue on this topic.
The new U.S. restrictions could further impact Russia's banking sector and the infrastructure supporting its oil exports. Reuters reports this. According to the agency, the White House administration has already developed the corresponding draft. Earlier, Kyiv called on Washington to disconnect all Russian banks from the dollar system.
The White House is currently monitoring Moscow's response to the measures already in place, and new sanctions are unlikely to be introduced in October, according to the Reuters publication.
The U.S. is also discussing the possibility of using frozen Russian assets. The U.S. notes that Washington supports the European Union's plans to direct blocked Russian funds toward purchasing American weapons for Ukraine. According to Reuters, about $7 billion of Russian assets have been frozen in the United States.
The EU is discussing a plan to provide Ukraine with 140 billion euros in the form of a loan, funded by the income from frozen Russian assets. Kyiv will only have to repay the funds if Moscow compensates for the damage caused.
On October 22nd, the United States imposed sanctions against Russia's largest oil corporations, Rosneft and Lukoil, and also froze the assets of companies associated with them. Amid these restrictions, Putin's special representative Dmitriev traveled to Washington. According to Axios, he met there with the U.S. President's special envoy, Steve Witkoff. And in an interview with CNN, he even claimed that Moscow and Kyiv were supposedly close to ending the war through diplomatic means. At the same time, Dmitriev said that supposedly U.S. sanctions and other measures against Russia would have absolutely no impact on the Russian economy. At the Center for Countering Disinformation under the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, they believe that the special envoy's statement is merely an attempt by the Kremlin to persuade the U.S. not to impose new restrictions.
Dmitriev is running around on U.S. broadcasts talking about how Russia wants peace and isn't afraid of sanctions. But for some reason, he's doing this right after Trump's sanctions. At the same time, Russia refuses to cease fire, and Dmitriev lies about an imminent diplomatic resolution to the war. Meanwhile, all of Dmitriev's running around, which is actually Russia's attempt to beg the U.S. not to impose new sanctions, is completely undermined by propagandist Solovyov, who threatens to destroy Odessa, Kharkiv, Kyiv, and other cities. October 25th.
U.S. President Donald Trump emphasized that he does not currently intend or plan to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin until a formal agreement is reached on a ceasefire by Russia against Ukraine.
I need to be sure that we are going to make a deal. I'm not going to waste my time. I've always had a good relationship with Putin, but this has really disappointed me. I thought this would be done long before peace was established in the Middle East.
Meanwhile, in Russia, nuclear threats are being used again. Putin stated that the nuclear forces of the Russian Federation, and I quote, are at the highest level in the world. The Kremlin dictator also boasted about testing the new Burevestnik nuclear missile. He announced this during a meeting with the chief of the Russian General Staff, Gerasimov, and the commanders of the military groups. Meanwhile, NATO chief Mark Rutte believes that Putin is running out of money, soldiers, and ideas. He stated this following the meeting of the Coalition of the Willing in London. He also welcomed the decision of European allies and Canada to provide additional military aid to Ukraine. In Ukraine,
Putin is making virtually no progress on the battlefield, and the minor gains he does achieve come at a very high cost. Hundreds of thousands of Russians are dying because of Putin's misguided aggression. Ukraine continues to defend itself bravely, and our support is helping them. The truth is that Putin is running out of money, troops, and ideas. President Trump pointed this out very well. They need to stop where they are. And now is the perfect time to increase pressure on Russia so that we can finally achieve a just and fair peace for Ukraine.
Earlier, speaking in Slovenia, Mark Rutte made an ironic comment about the state of the Russian fleet. He noted that Russia's naval presence in the Mediterranean has dwindled to nothing. Only one broken submarine remains there, which was limping back from patrol, said the NATO chief.
The United States will most likely forgo tariffs on goods from China. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated this in an interview with NBC. He said that the agreements reached with Chinese Vice Premier He Feng would allow U.S. President Donald Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping to have a constructive discussion on further trade cooperation as early as next week.
This was our fifth meeting with my Chinese counterpart, Vice Premier He Feng. We discussed a wide range of issues and I believe have established a solid foundation for further negotiations between the leaders of the two countries, who will meet in South Korea next Thursday. Let me remind you, earlier, the US President announced 100% tariffs if China were to impose global controls on the export of rare earth metals. I think we managed to avoid that, and the introduction of tariffs will be cancelled.
The U.S. President is expected to meet with the Chinese leader on October 30th on the sidelines of the APEC summit in South Korea. If a trade agreement between the two countries is reached, it will reduce the risk of a weakening global economy. Both countries have stated that they are close to reaching a potential agreement. Meanwhile, in Kuala Lumpur, the capital of Malaysia, during the ASEAN summit, Donald Trump concluded mutual trade agreements with Malaysia and Cambodia. According to the agreements, tariffs on imports of goods from these countries into the United States will be reduced. In response, the countries will ease requirements for imported American products. In addition, U.S. President Donald Trump joined in the signing of a peace agreement between Cambodia and Thailand. Tensions on the border between the two countries escalated into a 5-day conflict in July. At that time, dozens of civilians were killed and hundreds of thousands were forced to leave their homes. The initial ceasefire was signed on July 28th after the head of the White House held telephone talks with the leaders of both countries and warned that he would not enter into trade agreements with either of them if the conflict continued.
Now these gentlemen have signed what we call the Kuala Lumpur Peace Agreement. Both countries have agreed to cease all military actions and to work towards establishing good neighborly relations, which has already begun. 18 Cambodian prisoners of war will be released, and under this agreement, observers from ASEAN countries, including Malaysia, will be sent to ensure and maintain peace. I have no doubt that this will happen.
New incidents in Lithuanian airspace. Weather balloons from Belarus forced the authorities of the Baltic country to temporarily close border checkpoints with the Belarusian side and the capital's airport. Now the Prime Minister is convening the National Security Commission. How Europe is responding to Russian provocations. More in the report by Nikita Skobliakov.
Lithuania closed its border with Belarus for several hours and temporarily suspended operations at the capital's airport. The reason was suspicions that weather balloons had once again been launched into Lithuanian airspace from Belarus, according to the National Crisis Management Center. Such balloons have already been used more than once to smuggle contraband cigarettes. This time, the potential threat forced the authorities to act quickly. All checkpoints on the Lithuanian-Belarusian border were closed from 10:45 p.m. to 2 a.m.
If we're talking about smuggling, let's say, the same thing, but it's primarily aimed at the Baltic countries. The same balloons. Yes, this is an old business of Lukashenko's, which has been going on for years. Sales of Belarusian cigarettes on the European market, and by the way, on the Russian market as well. Now, yes, now it's drones and balloons. But here the question is how the Baltic countries will respond in this area, because, for example, sending up a plane just for balloons would be both foolish and expensive.
In the past week, this is already the second incident where weather balloons have violated Lithuanian airspace. And just a few days earlier, on October 23rd, 2 Russian military aircraft, an Su-30 and an Il-78, entered the country's airspace. According to the Lithuanian Air Force, the crews were likely conducting in-flight refueling. Nevertheless, the Vilnius authorities took the incident seriously. The Prime Minister announced the convening of the National Security Commission. I
am convening a meeting of the National Security Commission on Monday morning to discuss an action plan and further steps. I ask everyone to be patient. I understand your inconveniences and concerns, but we are acting in the interest of your safety. We are responding calmly and confidently. The border closure is a signal that we will not tolerate any violations.
and the Kremlin's hybrid attacks. In addition to pressure through migrant flows and cyber attacks, unknown drones are now being detected more and more frequently. Since the high-profile incident in Poland, when Russian drones entered its airspace on the night of September 10th, other European countries have also faced aerial provocations. Because of the appearance of UAVs, governments have been forced to temporarily close airports. In September 2025 alone, at least 15 such facilities suspended operations. In its resolution of October 8th, the European Parliament directly pointed to the involvement of the Russian Federation in these incidents. Not
by deploying military personnel directly, rather than using military forces in close proximity to their own borders, they are instead relying on remote capabilities. These are being used to divert the attention and valuable resources of our partners to internal problems, to targets that are irrelevant, and thus distract from the ongoing war in Ukraine, aiming to stop the provision of the level of support that is truly needed.
The main intelligence directorate of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense is convinced that Russia's hybrid war against Europe has three key objectives. The head of the main intelligence directorate, in an interview with the Italian newspaper, noted that in military science such actions are called reconnaissance by combat. According to him, one of the objectives is psychological in nature and is primarily aimed at the domestic audience within the Federation itself. But there are other factors as well.
The Russians are testing your reaction, your ability to make decisions, your willingness to use force. At the same time, they are conducting reconnaissance, identifying your systems, understanding how they work and where they are located. For them, this is a double benefit. If you Europeans grow tired of the war, the aid coming to us in Ukraine will decrease. Meanwhile, the Russians are spreading the idea among European peoples that it is not worth getting involved in the war with. I'm saying this is the Russian view on the matter. Kirill Budanov, head of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, in an interview with Il Foglio. And
still, European countries, particularly NATO members, are ready to respond to Russian threats. As early as next year, Sweden will deploy a battalion in Latvia equipped with anti-aircraft artillery combat vehicles. This was reported by the Latvian Ministry of Defense. They also clarified the following. The main task of the air defense units is to increase the capability for timely detection and neutralization of aerial targets, including drones and helicopters, at the tactical level in the Baltic region. Nikita Skublikov for Freedom TV channel.